Oh, maybe he learned that from Dad then. That could be the case. So Dad has instilled in him how to kill people whenever they're bad. All right, so there's a lot of bloodshed for sure that's been taking place, and that's immediately prior. Now, I know, and I apologize for this, we're a little bit rushed in the last piece of the class period, but what happens then as we begin chapter 3 in the first verse? So, does anyone else hear bells? No, go ahead. Oh, I said, does anyone else hear bells? I don't know. No? Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay, very good. So, yes, we have a half-brother who wants to marry a stepmom, and that's kind of weird. So then after, though, we have a young man in Solomon who, as far as we know, contracts his first spouse. And that is, it does seem to be in an effort to make an alliance with the people of Egypt. So he's going to marry the king's daughter to make that happen. Okay, and we're going to pick up in that spot, but here's what we have. So in the life of Solomon, there's the kingship, there is bloodshed, there is marriage, and naturally now we're going to have worship today. But before we get to that point, though, I do want to look back at verse 1, just because we didn't get much chance to discuss this at the end of the class period. 1 Kings chapter 3, for those who are with us, all our visitors, thank you for being here. It's a delight to have you. Verse 1 of 1 Kings 3, now Solomon made a treaty, as was stated right back here by Roy, with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. I suggested, just as a prospect, I'm not cut and dry, just one way or the other, could this be the first chink in the strong man's armor? That he starts to marry outside of the people of God and maybe starting to rely on a strength outside of the Lord's. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7. I do want to mention, as we're going to read in chapter 7, the first 6 verses. Again, that's Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 7, first 6 verses. And as we do read through this, I want to point out, I recognize there is a specific context, and that's partly why I want to back up to the first part of the chapter. I don't want to be guilty of proof texting. But the context is this, verse 1. When the Lord your God, rewinding, of course, about 500 years here, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, all of the Ites and the Vites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. 7 nations more numerous and mightier than yourselves. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. Verse 3, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their sons or their daughters for your sons. So who do you think they're supposed to be marrying then? Can't take the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, Perizzites. Yeah, they're going to be marrying one another. And of course, there are laws built in about incest. We're not talking about that, but within their own nation. And for us, it would be like marrying church members, essentially, as to what it would amount. And typically, not always, but we're all Americans. We're all the same nationality. That doesn't mean we're related to each other. And it's the same case with these people also. Okay, so having read this, is there any strict forbidding here of marrying an Egyptian? No. So in complete fairness to the text, it's not specifically stated, is it? However, let's look at the reasoning that the Lord has behind marrying outside the godly of his own people. So we left off in verse 3. Let's pick up in verse 4. Here's my reason, God says, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Why is that going to be the case, you think? That they're going to convince Israelites to serve different gods? Why would these 7 nations of Canaan maybe do that to the people? I'm sorry? Okay, they're not going to stay faithful to him. And the reason for that is all of these 7 nationalities, they have their own gods that they serve. And so, in fairness to the text, the first 3 verses, there is a context to it, and it's specifically about these 7 Canaanite nations. However, the general principle is, if there is a people that has other gods, other than me, God speaking, the one true God, here's the danger. They're going to turn away the descendants and the hearts, and maybe even yours also, from following after me. Okay, now understanding that point, yes, sir. Right, not specific. No, right, no. And it could be applicable to marriage, but no more than anything else, right? Yeah, very good, Roy. You're right. So a little bit of difference there. The Egyptians, who's their god? Huh? Okay. Right. Ray or Ra. Very good. And really that's an incorrect question to ask, isn't it? Who is their god, singular? Because remember that they have, like all the nations around them and after them, a plethora of gods. Of course, really interesting, Mu, the river god, and I mean all kinds of gods. Amon. Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah, so they have lots of gods. Anyway, the point is this. If God's reasoning is don't go outside of my people to marry among these 7 nations into the land where you're going, that's mainly the peoples they're going to be encountering there because they have other gods and they'll turn your hearts away and the hearts of your kids and your grandkids away and all that kind of stuff. And then he contracts, Solomon, a relationship with the daughter of the king of Egypt who has other gods. Naturally, what might be the result of that? So as we read on down in Deuteronomy 7, verse 4, then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall break down their altars when you go into this land, dash in pieces their pillars, chop down their Asherim. Those are the gods and goddesses of the Canaanites. Burn their carved images with fire. For, this is the reason, listen to this closely for tonight, you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of or apart from all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Okay, let's go back to our text now of 1 Kings 3, having picked up on some important principles there. Uh-huh. Right. Right. Yeah, that's it, right. And they're named after heads, aren't they? Often, yeah, good, Roy. So in verse 1 of 1 Kings 3, now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, married Pharaoh's daughter. We perceive from instruction God's already given there's some potential conflict there, and maybe, has he perhaps violated the principle that God has laid down? Okay, here's what I'd like for you to do, and then we'll come back to our text. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 8. 2 Chronicles 8, because this is information about the same event right here. But as we know, with these parallel passages, they provide a little more insight, one compared to another. 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 11. Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David, that's going to be Jerusalem, of course, to the house that he had built for her. He builds a separate house for this woman. Now, why do you think he might do that off the top of your head? We hear that and we think, oh, that's so romantic. He wants me to have just my own house. No, that's not it exactly. For he said, my wife shall not live in the house of David, king of Israel, for the places to which the ark of the Lord has come are holy. What does he insinuate about his new bride? She is unholy. She's impure. Okay, now I ask just in your mind's eye, you don't have to turn back there, but what we read in Deuteronomy 7, God says, don't intermarry with these pagan peoples, the 7 nationalities of the land of Canaan that I'm giving you to inherit. He says, because they'll turn your hearts away after their gods and your kids and your grandkids and all that kind of stuff. And then he says in verse 6 of Deuteronomy 7, for you are a holy people, and that's what I've called you to be. That's the whole spirit behind the command that's been given. it's almost to me like an acknowledgement on Solomon's part, I have done an unholy thing. And so I'm going to contain the unholy aspect right over here. And once more, I think that could give a little more firepower to the suggestion. Perhaps Solomon has begun to violate the commands of God, or maybe in the very least the spirit of why it was that God had commanded what he did in the first place. So I kind of left you with that last week and just wanted to state that. We didn't have much time to discuss it. So we have in verse 2, and that's going to begin, we're talking about the wisdom of Solomon in this section. He's demonstrated wisdom in politics at the end of chapter 2. And the first half of chapter 3 tonight, he's going to demonstrate wisdom in the requests that he makes of God. Verse 2, meanwhile the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. So this is brought out whenever we're talking about Solomon and his commitment to God. And this is another one. We won't just keep doing this endlessly. But I think it's important to give a little more emphasis to the opening of the class and to really understand the background of these things. I ask you to turn to Numbers chapter 33. We're going to try to gain a little more insight as to the high places of the Promised Land. Numbers 33. And as we do so, I want us to contemplate really what God's feelings about them are. 33, and we're looking at verses 50 through 52 toward the end of the chapter. And the Lord spoke to Moses. Don't forget, we're rewinding 500 years here. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their metal images, and demolish all their high places. Why is it, do you think, all these high places need to be demolished? What's going on at the high places? Okay, it's pagan worship, no doubt about that. Now, how does pagan worship differ from the worship of God? I mean, they have sacrifices that are given to. It's very common among the gods and goddesses. Well, what's different, though, in the Old Testament about the worship and maybe even in particular the sacrifices that are given to Yahweh? Okay, very good. Unfortunately, a number of deities, Molech's a real one that stands out. You might recall the statue of the quote-unquote God that holds out his arms to hold babies, okay, to be human sacrifice, a detestable thing, and God makes that very clear. I never want that. All right, very good. Animals, same thing. But as you read here, plural, places, being sacrificed in the high places. Where were the sacrifices for God's worship always given? This has been a while back, and it was eye-opening to me. I hate to admit this, just a few years ago, I never really stopped to consider that whenever people gave sacrifices in the Old Testament, they didn't just offer them wherever they wanted. There was always a set place, singular, where sacrifices were to be given. And where was that? At the tabernacle at this point in time, right? The temple has not been built, but it's just going to transfer then to that. So it's at a place. And on what structure? The bronze altar where the horns are found. You recall from our last class period, our members, people are going and taking a hold of the power of forgiveness. So, yeah, it's to be offered in a certain place. And it makes sense that God says, tear down the high places, plural, because you don't need to use all those places because I only allow sacrifice to come from one location. You think there might be any fulfillment later that's going to take place in that? What sense would that make in any foreshadowing? How have we been made right with God through sacrifice? One sacrifice in one place. By the way, the New Testament, Hebrews 13, also calls that place an altar, which is quite fascinating. And what location, by the way? What locale? What municipality? In the city of Jerusalem. And that's the very place where the centrality of worship is being shifted, still not fully there, but it's still in the process. So anyway, I say that to say this. The places, plural, were not needed In fact, not even one additional place, because God always has one place, and it's not going to be built according to the pattern of other gods. It's always going to be according to his pattern and the way he wants things done. So as you flip to Deuteronomy, just one book to your right, you'll go to chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, and they're going to read the first 6 verses. Deuteronomy 12, verses 1 through 6. These are the statutes, and excuse me, I'm sure you're aware, but Deuteronomy, of course, second giving of the law. So this is the second time this is being reiterated here. These are the statutes and rules that you should be careful to do in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess. All the days that you live on the earth, you shall surely destroy all the nations, places where the nations whom you shall dispossess served their gods. Start from scratch. Don't try to reform what they're doing. Restore or do worship the proper way. They were serving their gods on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree. Why do you think they might go up on hills and mountains to worship, give their sacrifices? Okay. Yeah, high places, and the higher you get, what's the way of human thinking? There you go, yeah, right, maybe so, Scott. And you're ascending up to the heavens, right? And of course, some gods they serve on earth, but some quote-unquote gods are seen to be in the sky. You mentioned Ra, the sun god, right? Okay, so some are perceived to be that way. That's probably why they're doing a lot of these high places. He says in verse 3, you shall tear down their altars, dash in pieces their pillars, burn their asherim, their gods, with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods, destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. But you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose. And notice, high places, tear down, burn, plural. But you shall seek the place, singular, that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation or his dwelling there. There you shall go, and you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. So in Numbers, we have the first giving of this law, and in Deuteronomy, duet, two, and onomy, referring to law, is the second giving of the law, the repetition of what that law is. And if you ever get scared in reading the book of Leviticus, there's good reason for that. Let's turn to Leviticus and let's get scared about what the consequences are if the people don't listen to this law, a chunk of which is to tear down these high places of the pagan worshipers. Leviticus chapter 26, Leviticus 26, and here we're going to read verses 27 through 33. So Leviticus 26, starting in verse 27. But in spite of this, as God has given at the start of this chapter, oh man, if you follow after me, you do worship my way, you serve me as I've commanded you, life is going to be grand for you, things will go tremendously for your nation. And then about verse 14 and following, it's, but if, and this is one of those in verse 27, but if in spite of this you will not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you in fury. And I myself will discipline you sevenfold, 7 times, perfect number of Scripture. I'll give you a perfect punishment as I deem worthy for your sins. You shall eat the flesh of your sons, and you shall eat the flesh of your daughters. In other words, things aren't going well in the nation at all. And I will destroy your high places if you don't do it, and cut down your incense altars, and cast your dead bodies upon the dead bodies of your idols. And my soul will abhor you, and I will lay your cities waste, and will make your sanctuaries desolate. I will not smell your pleasing aromas. I myself will devastate the land, so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled at it. And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheathe the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. Is it pretty clear the way God feels about high places? Okay. So we have Numbers, get rid of them. Deuteronomy, did you hear me the first time? Make sure when you go in, get rid of them. Leviticus, if you don't, there will be a curse that comes upon this land. Things will become so rough, nations will come against you, besiege you economically, things will go to pot. And whenever that happens, it'll be so bad that you'll have to eat your own kids to try to stay alive. You won't be able to hold on to your land. I will drive you out, and I'll take care of those high places myself. I want you to, we're not going to, go to and read any more about this. We need to move on. I want you to think about the year AD 70 and what it is that takes place, just for down the road. Well down the road, but think about that. So back in our text of 1 Kings chapter 3. Verse 2, meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places. So, if we pause and we reflect a little bit, what do you think God's feeling about that? I told you, and I told you again, and I warned you this is a dangerous thing, and there'll be punishment down the road to come for that. Okay. But we're told, maybe a little bit in their defense, because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. There was a tent, but not a house, not a fixture with a foundation. Verse 3, a real compliment's given to the man. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, and that may have reference to David really encourages him. You'll recall the last words of a father to his son late in life. And so it's the commandments of God, but that have been passed on by his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places, plural. So if there wasn't anything yet, there is something now we know. There's a chink in the armor of the man of God. He's doing a ton of things tremendously well. Now what's kind of strange to me, and well, I don't know if I'd say it as much anymore, but for years I always felt this, and I don't know about you, but how many times there will be violations of these guys, especially who are leading God's country, and it's like God's still with them, He still blesses them, He still recognizes them as faithful, and sometimes the question comes up, well, what does that mean for us in our time? Are there any commands of God that we can take lightly? Are there any that we can ignore and He'll be like, oh, well, that's all right. I still regard you as one of my own, right by my side. That can be a difficult thing to address and to explain. But before we move on, I want to look at one passage together. Turn to Acts chapter 17. This is the best way I've found to explain some of these things, some of these anomalies that do come up. Acts chapter 17, verses 30 and 31, and you're probably aware this is the Apostle Paul reasoning with the great philosophers of Grecian persuasion in the city of Athens, Greece. And he's talking with them. Of course, these are people who don't have a deep background and being taught about the true God, and he's just started to do that with them probably for the first time in their lives. But Acts 17, verses 30 and 31, after he talks about worshiping and serving gods that don't exist, and especially that are built by human beings of stone, silver, and gold, that kind of thing. Verse 30, he says, times have kind of changed, though. Truly, these times of ignorance, God overlooked. But now, as a contrast, he commands all men everywhere to repent. And he explains in verse 31, he's appointed a day on which he has set one person over all the world to judge in righteousness, that one is the individual who's lived absolutely perfectly righteously, Jesus Christ, and he's going to execute all that judgment of God. But the point is this, there was a time period in which people did really dumb things, and God overlooked. But now, or there's something different about our time, he commands all men everywhere to repent. Marty?
I think I'm in the right context here, but talking about
Right.
the law.
Yeah. Yeah, Deuteronomy 17 for those, yeah. Right, you're exactly right. Yeah, thank you. And that would be a help to make up for, I didn't know. Where's your copy? I told you. And they're to read it constantly, right? Yeah, very good, Marty. So, this is my best understanding of what we find in the Old Testament, as well as this statement that's made about obvious errors in times prior to the New Testament age. I believe God treated nations, and that includes His own people, just like in families, we treat human beings as they come up through the ranks. And in the earliest years of humanity, God always wanted the best things out of people. He wanted them to do what was right, yet as an entire race, we were in a state of infancy. We were a little bit ignorant. We didn't have a lot of experience. And then you fast forward, say, I'm not going to say these are the exact numbers, okay, but you fast forward 1,000 years into the 6,000 years of human history, and okay, well, now we're toddlers. We have a little bit more information. We're understanding things better. We've seen more of the world, and you keep going. until the point that you get to the Christian age, and at that juncture, the human race is a full-fledged adult. And we're left to fend for ourselves in the sense that we have no excuses. We've seen all the mistakes of history. And I believe that's what it is, that as time progresses and the human race matures, God expects more out of what his original will was all along. And whenever you're dealing, of course, we're going to get into that with the life of Solomon. We've seen it in David. You see it with Abraham, and you can go way back from there. As Jesus makes very clear, it was never the intention of God from the beginning for people to multiply their wives, understanding those are surviving. And it was never God's intention for divorce ever to take place under any circumstance. That's never what God wanted. But he says, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. And God obviously went through a period whenever he allowed also people to get extra spouses. And we know they were considered faithful to him when you're dealing with people like Abraham and David. I know Solomon's going to go through a rough patch, and he's going to exponentially multiply that. But there are a lot of other things and applications that we can make also. So as we step back to our text, and I'm not trying to move on before anyone can make a comment. If you want, you're welcome, or ask a question. But in verse 3, when we're told Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, doing everything that God has told him to do, except, this is a chink in the armor for sure, if we haven't already found one in verse 1. He sacrificed and he burned incense at the high places, plural, a direct prohibition of a command that God has given. I think this is probably an instance where the human race is maybe kind of at that adolescent, maybe pre-adolescent stage, and God's like, man, I really don't like that. That's really not what I'm after. And it's going to get to a point as a race, Acts 17, 30 and 31, it's, look, there are no exceptions anymore. I'm not overlooking anything anymore. And it's my way or the highway, and there's going to be judgment. And we're going to answer to the one who's given this law. So if that's a help in any way, that's my best understanding of some of these things and what we find right here also. But if you want, you're welcome to chime in also before we move on. Yes? Yeah. And I appreciate, no, he's still there. So I appreciate both your and Scott's comments on that. Those coalesce very well, yeah. Thank you for that. It could be. It makes a lot of sense about the pride and one's own will getting in the way. Now, let me also toss out, before we move on, I know we need to, but let me toss out another suggestion. Solomon already has so much reformation, so much change that's going on, and it may very well be that he wants to do that thing as well. Maybe he has a fear on the inside of too much positive change and all at once. I mean, is that a possibility? And maybe he thinks, this needs to be addressed, but we'll get around to it whenever the time is right. If that's the case, it doesn't appear to be something that ever is addressed, and we don't know that for sure. But again, I'm just tossing that out as maybe something that could be a prospect in his mind. So he's doing a lot of good things. There is this blemish, though, in the record. Verse 4, now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for there was the great high place. There are all these high places. This one, hey, are you Rebecca? This is the big one, though. This is the high. But in fairness to him, there is something to this. Okay, so keep your spot, and let's go to the parallel of 2 Chronicles chapter 1. I don't believe we're going to do this anymore tonight as far as parallels go. But this one does bring in a pretty important detail here as to why Solomon wanted to do this, and it's good for us because it's been a long time since we talked about it. 2 Chronicles 1, verses 3 and 4. And Solomon and all the assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon. So this is not Solomon all by his lonesome. This is Solomon leading the entire nation here. So Solomon, he leads all the assembly with him. He goes to the high place that is at Gibeon for the tent of meeting of God, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, had made in the wilderness, was there. But David had brought up the ark of God from Kiriath-Jearim, or Kiriath-Yearim, to the place that David had prepared for it, for he had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. So if that helps clear up anything, there's a reason that he goes to this particular one. If you're wondering, Gibeon is a suburb of Jerusalem. You can see it in red there on the map. It's a little bit, about 5 miles up. I know the scale's not on there, but it's about 5 miles up to the northwest of Jerusalem. And I do want to mention here, the definition of the town Gibeon is hill city. So what a perfect place for the tabernacle of God to be. It's on this high point, and it's that great high point. But he goes to this place because that's where the tabernacle of God is found. If you're wondering, well, I thought we'd moved it to Jerusalem by this point. It's not. It's easy to get confused. There is something at Jerusalem that David has brought into it, but what's that place? Or what is that thing, I should say? Well, that's a place too. Okay, so there's another tent or another tabernacle, and it's housing what? The ark of God that's been rescued, and it used to be in the most holy place of the tabernacle. It's not found in the most holy place anymore. After all that crazy stuff that happens and the curses, and the Israelites are able to get it home and safely to Jerusalem, it's like, let's build its own little tent and just keep that thing over there. And it's not taken back into the tabernacle of meeting any longer. But in our text of 1 Kings 3, that's why exactly he goes to Gibeon. I think that's helpful, the parallel, because it reminds us that's where the tabernacle is located at this point. And in that great high place, Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. This is one of those numbers I think it helps. Let's biblically factor it down. What do we have with the number 1,000 of biblical numerical significance? 10 to the third power, or 10 times 10 times 10. 10 is the number of? No, well, no, not quite. Yeah, it's close though. Of completeness. 10 is the number of completeness. And I think what it is he's giving a complete sacrifice to whom? The 3, the divine number. So a complete sacrifice to the Almighty, to the divine number, to God himself. And that could be the relevance of 1,000, 10 to the third power, 10 times 10 times 10. Well, verse 5, apparently, God is listening. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And this is further confirmation to me. He considers him to be one of his faithful. He's pleased with him. There's something that's off in his life right here, and I think this is one of those moments of ignorance that he's very kindly overlooking. He appears to Solomon in a dream by night, and God says, "Ask, what shall I give you?" And Solomon said, "You have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son, me, to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord, my God," and you do see relationship here between the two. It's not simply God of my father, but it's you're my God also. You're working in me as you did in my father. You have made your servant king. I'm before you in, Rebecca, humility and obedience instead of my father David. But listen to this remark. I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Do you think Solomon's entering kindergarten next week at this point? What does he mean, I'm a little child? He's not a little baby. He's not a big baby. He's a man. He's a grown man. What does he mean by I'm a little child? Huh? Okay, he doesn't have any understanding. Look, I'm not as sharp as I need to be for this. Really, who is? For this kind of a task. And what was the great teaching of God in the flesh himself when he's on the earth? Oh, you want to be great. You want to become you want to be like a king, huh? All right, this is the way to go about it, and God's blessings to be found with you. How do you do that? First of all, Jesus says, hang on a second, I need a prop here. Doesn't have PowerPoint back then, so he goes and he gets his prop. What's his prop? A little child. He says, you have to become like this one. And his teaching behind that, Rebecca, is therefore whoever humbles himself as this little child will become great, will be number one, will be like the king that you want to be. And how refreshing that you have a leader. You have someone with all this power at his disposal to, in humility, come before God and say, I'm nothing. I'm like a little child right now. He is, in fact. He's full of humility, and his heart is committed to God. He's obeying him nearly in every way. Okay, probably a thing or two that could be cleaned up a little bit, but a lot of good things going on in his life. He says, I don't know, Scott. I don't understand how to go out or to come in. I have no experience, well, not enough anyway. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be counted or numbered. Quite frankly, maybe a little too dangerous to be counted or numbered. Remember the last time that was attempted. You don't want to do that, even if you could do such a thing. Verse 9, therefore give to your servant. If you give me anything I want, this is what I want. Give me an understanding heart, because I don't understand. Give me more wisdom to judge your people, that I may discern between good or evil. God, I only want to do what's right. I only want to do what pleases you. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? I don't think we're too surprised, verse 10, that the speech pleased the Lord. Solomon understands, even at a fairly young age, not like baby age, but as a man, maybe even a young man at this point, he understands what it takes to be king, what it takes to be number one, what it takes to be great. To have a heart filled with humility and that wants to please God. Then God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and really I think what it is that impresses God as well, he says, all the things you have not asked me. You have not asked long life for yourself. You have not asked riches for yourself. You have not asked the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself understanding or wisdom to discern justice. Behold, I have done, according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall there like you arise anyone after you. What a blessing. Can you imagine being in Solomon's shoes and you're just worshiping God, and of course in an age where he manifests himself in such manners. He shows up and has a conversation, granted this is at night through a dream with him, but he shows up and essentially what God does is he gets one of his heavenly checks and he writes the date of it and he signs it and puts the memo, but he leaves the amount blank. And he just hands it to Solomon. He says, here, you just write in whatever it is, however much, I'll give it to you. I'm not saying necessarily money, but it's a sense of anything you want, you could have. Wouldn't that be, what would you ask if God have heaven's payroll and the check, and he signed it, he's dated it, here you go, just write in, put your name on it, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Anything. Well,
we talk about this at how the world corrupts us.
right. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. It's almost like when we put first things first, all the other things get added to us, right? I think I've heard that maybe somewhere before. Maybe sang it, I don't know. James chapter 4. Turn there if you will. We're going to largely conclude on this. We'll go back to our text just for a little bit. James chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. Man, if only we could be in Solomon's shoes. God says, and understand this is our age here. You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight with people and you quarrel. You do not have, because you have not asked me. You see what God is inviting every one of us to? Is there something that you really want? And you're convinced that it's a good thing and for a good reason. You know you need that. Just ask me for it. You'll try anything and everything to get it. Why don't you just pause for 5 seconds and talk to me about it? I'll give it to you, is what he's saying. Verse 3, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, as Paul brought out, to spend it on your passions. Now we can say, well, I want it because I want to rid the world of poverty. But if we don't really mean that, then something's off right there. And God knows that if it's the case. But if we have good intentions behind it, and we're sure that it's for a good purpose, God says, just ask me, whatever it is, and I'll give it to you. Remember how this works with Solomon? God shows up one night and he says, hey, dude, just ask. I'll give it to you. That kind of sounds familiar with us, doesn't it? Go back now to chapter 1 of James. James 1, verses 5 through 8. If any of you lacks wisdom, what are we supposed to do? Let him ask God, who gives generously to King Solomon and nobody else. Does your version read differently there than mine? What's yours say? Ask God who gives generously to King Solomon and nobody else? What's your say? Oh, so not just Solomon. Okay. And without reproach, meaning like not just to kings and to queens, but also to whom? The little people like you and I. He cares just as much about us as he does kings and queens like Solomon. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that's tossed back and forth. That person must not suppose he'll receive anything from the Lord. This hit me several years. It's been a number of years ago, but it's like, man, that'd be so cool to be Solomon. And I realized, wait a minute, I am Solomon, and so are you. We're just mentally like little kids, and we don't understand how to go about things like we need to. And God says, admit that to me. That's okay. And beg me for what you need more than anything else. Just ask me for wisdom. He says, I'll pour it out liberally is what that word means, beyond your wildest dreams, just like I did with my servant Solomon. This isn't just reserved for him. It's not just for kings and for queens. It's also for the average Joes and Janes, you and I alike. You realize the same offer that was given to Solomon by God is the very offer that he gives to every one of us. No different. All we have to do is ask for it. Now, as was pointed out by Paul back in our text of 1 Kings 3, who would like to say our memory verse, by the way? 1 Kings 3:13. Isn't that something? He didn't even ask for that stuff. And God said, I'm going to give you what you asked for, and because you had your priorities in order, I'm also going to give you everything that you didn't ask for and that most people want. Man, if only... right. But there is, in principle, some application, I think, to you and I. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. Ephesians 3, 20 and 21. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly, abundantly, beyond all that we ask or think. Do you think it could be that Jesus really means it when he says, you put first things first, get your priorities of spirituality in order, and there'll be physical blessings that come along too? Now, does that mean we're going to be multimillionaires? No. But it does mean that he's going to take care of the things that do arise of a physical nature in life. I always like to call this in the Bible, I'll take care of your needs plus one. No, it's not the gospel of prosperity, but it is the plus one gospel. I'll always more than take care of you. You're not going to have to worry about physical things. So let's finish up our passage in 1 Kings 3 just with a couple more words here. Verse 14. So if you walk in my ways, this is key, Solomon, to keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. He didn't ask for that. But because his priorities order, he'll give him that too. Then Solomon awoke. What a night. And indeed it had been a dream. But he knows this isn't any ordinary old dream. He came to Jerusalem and he stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. He offered up more burnt offerings, offered up more peace offerings, and he also made a feast of celebration for all of his servants. The wisdom of Solomon we have seen on display. It has showed up. It's been very prevalent in politics. It is apparent in the requests that he makes of God. In what other ways will we see the wisdom of Israel's third king be manifested in the coming weeks? Rebecca? Yeah, that's true. You're exactly right. It's helpful for one to prove oneself, okay, and then, yeah, more blessings to be added. I'm with you. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so for next time, make sure you read all of chapter 3. We'll cover more territory if possible. Memorize the last verse of chapter 3, which is number 28, 1 Kings 3:28. And the best advice, some of the best advice I've ever given ever heard in my life, I'd like to repeat that now as we close. If you don't have a habit of it already, pray to God for wisdom every single day. He will bless and give. All right, thank you.